Folks, there are bad military decisions, and then there's attacking a Terran factory powered by a star. See, the Datari Assembly looked at the Quintar system and saw a bunch of refinery workers, mining tugs, and industrial equipment. No defense fleet, no major military presence. Looked soft. Problem was, the Terrans had spent 40 years turning the biggest factory in Federation space into the galaxy's angriest industrial accident. And when the Datari attacked, well, turns out humans don't really separate industry from warfare. Humans weaponized the factory. The Quintar system sat way out on the edge of Terran space where star charts got fuzzy and patrol schedules turned into polite suggestions. Most folks in the Federation barely remembered the place existed unless they happened to build military hardware for a living. Then suddenly, Quintar became mighty important, because near every Terran warship in the galaxy carried armor, support framing, or reactor shielding made from one thing: sun steel. Problem was, nobody but the Terrans really understood where the stuff came from. Now, the Quinari had been living in that system for near 3,000 years. Nice folks, peaceful, good traders. Could make seafood stew strong enough to dissolve bad attitudes right out of your bloodstream. But they had absolutely no idea what they were sitting on. The fourth planet in the system was covered in ancient ruins, giant black towers sticking out of the ground, orbital rings hanging over the atmosphere, buried machines bigger than cities. Half the place looked like somebody started building a civilization and got distracted halfway through. The Quinari figured it was probably some kind of sacred site left behind by a dead species and decided the smart thing to do was leave it alone. Humans, unfortunately, had different ideas. See, about 100 years earlier, the Datari Assembly rolled into Quinari space looking for territory and resources. The Quinari military lasted about 9 days before things started looking real grim. Then the Terran Federation showed up with a carrier group, several cruisers, and what historians later described as an aggressive disagreement regarding borders. That disagreement ended with half the Datari fleet scattered across 3 moons and the other half running for home with reactor fires burning in their engine sections. Afterward, the Quinari joined the Federation under Terran protection, and humans started poking around the ruins on the fourth planet, which was mistake number 1, because humans react to ancient alien mysteries the same way raccoons react to unsecured garbage cans. Sooner or later, somebody's going to pry the lid off just to see what happens. Turns out the answer was a whole lot of explosions. Over the next 50 years, the Terrans dug into every tunnel, tower, chamber, and buried machine they could find. There were cave-ins, radiation leaks, orbital fires, magnetic storms, and one memorable incident where an engineer accidentally launched a mining tug clean through a refinery wall while yelling, "I got it under control," moments before very clearly not having it under control. Folks kept dying too. That part tended to get forgotten later on account of the explosions were more entertaining. But the truth was, the Terrans paid for every secret in that place one bad day at a time. Then finally, after the planet became populated mostly by the old, engineers and mechanics retired from old wars and old ships, somebody figured it out. Whole damn planet was a factory, not a city. Not a temple. Factory. A stellar-scale foundry built by some long-dead civilization that used the focused power of Quintar's sun itself to smelt and refine a metal ore mined out of the asteroid belts. Giant orbital mirrors redirected solar energy into furnaces buried deep under the planet's crust. The temperatures inside those chambers got so hot, most known alloys just vaporized outright. Only one material survived the process, sun steel, and buddy, that stuff was mean. Light as composite plating, stronger than battleship armor, highly conductive, near impossible to crack once it cooled. Matter of fact, most Federation scientists claim the metal probably shouldn't exist naturally at all. Terran engineers heard that and immediately started building warships out of it. Of course, that changed the balance of power in the galaxy real fast. Federation ships started surviving hits that ought to split cruisers clean apart. Destroyers stayed combat capable after shield failures. Carrier hulls stopped buckling under plasma bombardment. Terran captains developed dangerous levels of confidence, which is generally considered unhealthy for everybody involved. Naturally, this made the Datari Assembly nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. For decades, Datari spies watched the Quintar system grow bigger, hotter, and stranger. Orbital foundries expanded every year. Solar mirrors multiplied. Asteroid mining operations spread across the entire system. Freight traffic never stopped. Yet every report kept saying the same thing. Very few military ships. The place looked industrial, not defensive, and right about then the Federation got tangled up in a major war way off near the Vekari front. Most of the active fleet got dragged clear across Federation space. Reinforcement times to Quintar stretched into weeks. The Datari Assembly looked at all that and made the kind of decision that usually ends with Terrans building memorial statues afterward. The invasion fleet dropped into the system under full combat power. 2 carrier groups, assault ships, troop transports, 11 cruisers, enough firepower to conquer 3 ordinary systems without much trouble. Datari Admiral Qatar stood on the bridge of the battleship Dominion Claw, studying the tactical display with the relaxed confidence of a man who had absolutely no idea he was fixing to become part of an industrial accident. "No defense fleet detected," one officer reported. Qatar gave a satisfied little twitch of his mandibles. "The Terrans have finally learned restraint." Down below, the 4th planet turned slowly beneath the stars. Massive foundries glowed orange against the darkness. Cargo haulers drifted between orbital stations. Mining tugs shoved asteroids through traffic lanes with sleepy precision. It looked harmless, busy, and soft. Then one of the officers frowned. "Sir, the orbital mirrors are moving." Qatar barely glanced at the display. "Mining operations." Every alarm on the bridge went off at once. A beam of concentrated solar fire ripped across space so bright the tactical screens automatically darkened to keep the crew from going blind. The beam crossed 12,000 kilometers in less than a heartbeat and hit the cruiser Silent Judgment dead center. For about 1 second, the ship stayed intact. Then the armor started running like candle wax. The whole cruiser sagged sideways, glowed white, and folded clean in half before detonating into a cloud of molten debris and expanding plasma. Silence filled the Dominion Claw. Way down on the surface of the factory world, a Terran refinery supervisor watched the burning wreckage streak across the sky through reinforced windows while holding a cup of coffee in one hand. "Well," he muttered, "let's see if they still want to be rowdy." For about 10 full seconds, nobody on the Datari flagship said a word. Not because they were disciplined, neither. Mostly because the human brain, the alien brain, and probably several forms of advanced livestock all tend to react the same way when they watch a heavy cruiser melt like butter left too close to a campfire. The tactical officer finally found his voice first. "Sir, the Silent Judgment has been destroyed." Now, Admiral Qatar had spent near 40 years in military service. He'd fought pirates, border wars, separatists, smugglers, and one unfortunate rebellion involving weaponized farming equipment. He considered himself calm under pressure, but even he stared at the tactical display for a second too long before asking the obvious question. By what? Meanwhile, down on the fourth planet, nobody seemed especially concerned. That right there probably should have worried the Datari more than the giant death beam. Inside Control Station 12, refinery workers kept walking between consoles while warning sirens flashed overhead. Somebody was eating noodles. One woman in a stained work jacket was arguing with maintenance about coolant pressure while a cruiser burned up in orbit over her head. A younger Quinari technician looked absolutely horrified. We just destroyed a warship. The old Terran supervisor beside him sipped coffee. Yep, that was a military cruiser. Sure was. Should we be evacuating? The supervisor blinked at him. Why? Up in orbit, Admiral Qatar finally regained enough dignity to start yelling at people. Return fire immediately. That's the problem, sir, the weapons officer replied nervously. We do not have a target. What do you mean you do not have a target? The beam came from the orbital mirror array itself. Qatar stared at him. The mining equipment? Yes, sir. See, the funny thing about Terrans was they never really separated industrial equipment from military equipment. To humans, the difference mostly came down to whether lawyers were currently involved. The Sunforge orbital array had originally been built to redirect solar energy into the foundries below. Giant mirrors the size of cities collected focused stellar radiation and bounced it through magnetic lensing systems into the planetary furnaces. Humans took one look at that setup about 30 years earlier and said, "Reckon we can point it somewhere." Turns out they absolutely could. The second beam hit before the Datari could reorganize formation. This one swept across the destroyer Spear of Dawn and cut straight through the engine section. Half the ship vanished into expanding vapor while the front half kept drifting forward on momentum alone. One Terran worker down in orbital alignment control watched the tactical feed and whistled softly. Well now, that one reached a little deeper than expected. Another worker glanced over from his console. You want a lower output? Nah, let's see if she explodes twice. The Spear of Dawn exploded twice. That was about the moment the Datari fleet stopped thinking of the Quintar system as an industrial target and started thinking of it as whatever in the fresh hell this is. Unfortunately for them, things were just getting started. The Asteroid tugs entered the fight next. Now, most species used automated systems for large-scale asteroid movement because manually guiding rocks the size of small mountains through crowded orbital lanes was considered dangerous, stressful, and generally terrible for employee morale. Terrans hired old tug pilots named things like Buck, Wanda, Earl, and Skeeter, which explained a lot right there. Across the system, dozens of massive industrial tugs detached from mining operations and powered up heavy drives. Giant magnetic clamps shoved asteroids out of stable processing lanes and aimed them directly at the incoming Datari fleet. At first, the Datari commanders ignored the rocks entirely. That turned out to be another poor decision. One tactical officer frowned at the incoming mass signatures. Collision objects detected. Qatar waved dismissively. Minor debris. Sir, one of the debris fields is approximately 20 kilometers wide. Qatar slowly looked back toward the display. Why? Down in Tug Control 7, a Terran pilot named Earl Granger scratched his beard while lining up a moon-sized asteroid on his targeting screen. His co-pilot stared nervously at the numbers. "Earl, that rock's technically classified as a minor moon." Earl shrugged. "Not if it hits something." Then he shoved the drive controls forward. The asteroid tug engines roared, and 20 billion tons of rock started moving directly toward the Datari formation. Now, technically speaking, asteroid shields were designed to handle impacts, small impacts, reasonable impacts, not the entire local geology suddenly developed hostile intentions. The first collision obliterated a Datari frigate outright. Shields failed instantly. The asteroid punched through the ship so hard pieces of both wound up embedded in another cruiser 300 kilometers behind it. Another rock clipped the edge of a carrier shield and overloaded the entire defense grid in a shower of electrical discharge. Seconds later, one of the solar beams cut the helpless carrier straight down the middle. Inside the Dominion claw, the tactical display started looking less like a battle and more like a demolition derby designed by lunatics. "Sir," the communications officer stammered, "we are intercepting civilian transmissions." "On screen," the bridge speakers crackled. A calm human voice filled the command deck. "Attention, unidentified hostile fleet. Quintar industrial operations are currently experiencing delays due to incoming debris. We appreciate your patience during this difficult time." Another voice shouted somewhere in the background, "Carl, quit using the solar lance to light cigarettes." "Worked, didn't it?" Qatar stared at the speaker in disbelief. "They're making jokes." One of his officers looked equally disturbed. "Sir, I do not believe these people understand fear." Way down on the surface, they absolutely understood fear. That was why the Terrans had spent 40 years turning the biggest factory in Federation space into the galaxy's angriest industrial accident. And now that somebody had attacked it, well, folks were finally getting to use all the fun stuff. By the end of the first hour, Admiral Qatar had lost 4 cruisers, 2 frigates, most of a carrier group, and what little peace of mind he'd brought with him into the Quintar system. The tactical display hanging over the bridge of the Dominion claw looked less like a battle and more like somebody had thrown a lit grenade into an industrial scrapyard. Solar beams kept flashing across space without warning. Asteroids drifted through formation like hostile moons. Cargo haulers rammed damaged ships. One refinery tug somehow launched a full ore container through the bridge of a destroyer at near orbital velocity. And through all of it, the Terrans still hadn't deployed a proper defense fleet. That part bothered Qatar more than anything else. The entire situation felt insulting. "These are civilians," one of his officers finally muttered. Qatar turned slowly toward him. "Then why are they winning?" Nobody answered, mostly because another cruiser exploded right then and distracted everybody for a moment. Now, the smart thing at that point would have been retreat. Generally speaking, once industrial machinery starts developing offensive opinions, it's probably time to reconsider your choices. But Qatar had already lost too much to back down. Datari politics were meaner than most wars, and returning home after getting whipped by factory workers would likely result in his ceremonial execution and several unpleasant newspaper articles. So instead, he changed tactics. "If the orbital systems cannot be neutralized," he growled, "then we seize the planet directly." That made sense to the Datari officers again. Ground invasions were normal, understandable. Soldiers fighting civilians. Order restored. They could work with that. Much easier than explaining how a refinery turned 2 cruisers into molten rain. drop ships launched by the hundreds. Assault carriers burned into the atmosphere while orbital bombardment batteries opened fire across the surface. Refinery towers vanished in sheets of flame. Dockyards collapsed. Cargo rails exploded. Massive warning sirens echoed across the industrial districts as workers scrambled through smoke-filled corridors beneath flashing emergency lights. And for the first time all day, the Terrans started looking serious. Inside Processing District 14, giant blast doors slammed shut one after another, while crews hauled crates out of secured lockers and emergency armories. Quinari civilians hurried toward underground shelters while Terran workers moved in the opposite direction entirely, toward the fight. A young Quinari technician stopped dead when he saw an older human welder open a heavy storage compartment filled with matte black armor plates and weapons. "I thought those were emergency suits," the Quinari said nervously. The welder grunted while strapping on heavy gloves. "They are." "That armor looks military," the old man snorted. "Military gear's cheaper." Now see, that right there was something most species never quite understood about Terran industrial workers. Half of them were former military anyway. Retired engineers, old mechanics, shipyard welders, reactor specialists, folks who'd spent 30 years building warships or repairing them after battles. The Federation didn't exactly send soft people to babysit giant solar furnaces, and after 40 years on Quintar, everybody on that planet had quietly accepted one simple truth. Someday somebody was going to come for the Sunforge. So they prepared. The first Datari dropships landed outside Processing Complex Theta just after local dusk. Heavy infantry poured across the landing zones in tight formation while plasma fire lit the night sky blue. Datari troops advanced fast, disciplined and confident right up until the ground underneath them exploded. Industrial mining charges tore through the lead assault lines and sent armored soldiers cartwheeling through the air in pieces. Hidden ore loaders burst out of concealed bays and opened fire with magnetic excavation spikes originally designed for asteroid drilling. One Datari officer barely had time to shout a warning before a 3-foot mining spike punched through him. 2 soldiers behind him and the side of a troop transport. Inside the refinery corridors, the workers hit back even harder. Terrans in heavy sun-steel-lined industrial suits moved through the smoke carrying weapons that looked homemade because, honestly, most of them were. Turns out factory workers get real creative when somebody threatens their workplace and giving them days off, and an advanced species fabrication shop could be dangerous. One woman stepped around a corner carrying what looked suspiciously like a modified plasma cutter attached to an industrial fuel tank. A nervous Quinari beside her glanced at the setup and swallowed hard. "Is that safe?" The woman thought about it for a second. "Probably not." Then she pulled the trigger. A stream of white-hot plasma flooded the corridor and melted straight through 3 Datari soldiers and most of the wall behind him. Elsewhere, the fighting got uglier. Mining exosuits built for lifting ore containers started punching through armored infantry like beer cans. Welders used thermal cutters that sliced rifles apart in showers of sparks. Security crews carrying sun-steel riot shields walked straight through incoming plasma fire while returning shots with industrial nail drivers powerful enough to penetrate bulkheads. One Datari squad breached a furnace chamber only to discover 6 Terran workers waiting inside with magnetic cutting saws. That problem solved itself real quick. From orbit, Qatar watched the surface battle unravel with growing disbelief. His officers looked just as shaken. "These are not trained soldiers," one whispered. "No," Qatar replied slowly while staring at the tactical display. "They are worse." Down below, an old refinery supervisor named Hank Mercer crouched behind a barricade made from overturned ore containers while reloading a heavy industrial launcher. Plasma bolts screamed overhead while younger workers rushed ammunition crates between cover points. "Hank!" somebody shouted over the noise. "We got another drop ship coming near the east furnaces." Hank peeked over the barricade. "Big one?" "Real big." Hank nodded thoughtfully and keyed his comm unit. "Earl?" The reply crackled back instantly. "Yeah? You still got that ugly asteroid parked over Furnace Ridge?" There was a pause. "Depends. Depends on what?" "Y'all asking legally?" Hank grinned. "Reckon I'm asking urgently." Earl sighed heavily over the comm. "Well, hell. Let me go ruin somebody's afternoon." High above the planet, one of the Datari troop carriers suddenly vanished off tactical screens. Not exploded, not disabled, just gone. 5 seconds later, a massive asteroid punched straight through the middle of the assault formation and scattered burning wreckage across low orbit. Silence settled over the bridge of the Dominion Claw. One Datari officer whispered softly, "Sweet mercy." And right about then, Admiral Qatar finally understood the truth. The Terrans hadn't weaponized the factory after the invasion started. They'd been preparing this place for war for 40 years. And somehow the workers still looked like they were enjoying themselves. By the start of the second day, the Datari invasion had officially turned into what military historians later described as a catastrophic series of increasingly personal mistakes. Admiral Qatar had stopped asking for victory projections sometime around the third exploding cruiser. At this point, he mostly asked questions like, "Why does the refinery have torpedoes?" And "How is that building still firing?" Unfortunately, nobody aboard the Dominion Claw had useful answers anymore. The Quintar system had become a full-blown industrial war zone. Solar lances flashed across orbit every few minutes. Asteroid tugs drifted through debris fields hunting for fresh ammunition. Cargo haulers carried supplies one direction and pieces of Datari ships the other. And somehow, despite all common sense, the workers were winning. That part bothered Qatar most of all. Soldiers losing to military units was understandable. Embarrassing maybe, but understandable. Soldiers losing to welders and refinery crews who smelled faintly of machine oil and kept arguing about overtime during firefights was something else entirely. The latest reports from the surface didn't help his mood none either. Entire refinery districts remained under worker control while Datari assault forces got steadily pushed backward through industrial corridors designed by what one surviving officer described as sadistic engineers with unlimited funding and emotional problems. Down in Refinery District 9, Hank Mercer stepped over a burning plasma cannon while chewing on half a sandwich somebody handed him 20 minutes earlier. Around him, the refinery floor looked like a steel mill and a battlefield had gotten drunk together and made poor decisions. Sparks rained from damaged overhead rails while automated cranes still tried to continue normal operations despite explosions rattling the facility every few seconds. Somewhere nearby, a loudspeaker calmly announced that Furnace 3 was operating above recommended thermal limits. A second later, another voice cut in over the system and said, "Yeah, we know. right before the loudspeaker exploded. A young Quinari crouched beside Hank behind a damaged ore processor and stared at the chaos with wide, terrified eyes. "Humans are insane," he muttered. Hank shrugged. "Little bit." "No, seriously. You people turned an industrial planet into a fortress." "Well, sure. That should not be normal." Hank gave him a confused look. "Buddy, if your species owned a giant death factory powered by a star, what exactly did y'all think humans was going to do with it?" Before the Quinari could answer, something enormous slammed into the refinery roof hard enough to shake the entire structure. Workers nearby barely looked up from what they were doing. One older woman calmly kept reloading an industrial nail driver while muttering that somebody was being rough with the equipment again. Outside the facility, the answer became obvious real quick. A damaged Datari assault carrier had crashed directly into one of the old Orbital support towers after catching a solar lance through the engines. The wrecked ship leaned sideways against the structure while fire poured from the broken hull across half the district. Then the support tower started moving. Now, this was the part the Datari never knew about. Over 40 years, the Terrans hadn't simply repaired the ancient systems. They'd modified them constantly, added new controls, expanded power routing, integrated Federation targeting systems, weaponized anything that looked remotely dangerous. And somewhere along the line, a group of Terran engineers looked at several 100-mile-wide orbital support structures and asked what was historically a very dangerous question. What else can this thing do? Turns out the answer was quite a lot. Across the Quintar system, ancient machinery dormant for thousands of years began waking up fully for the first time since the original builders disappeared. Massive sections of the orbital rings rotated out of fixed alignment. Hidden magnetic rails unfolded from buried structures beneath the planet's crust. Gigantic energy conduits lit up across the dark side of the world like glowing rivers. Entire sections of the ancient foundry began reconfiguring themselves with deep grinding noises that echoed through orbit. Inside the Dominion claw, every tactical screen suddenly flooded with new contact alerts. One officer swallowed hard. "Sir, we are detecting additional weapon systems." Qatar looked ready to strangle somebody. "From where?" The officer hesitated for a second too long. "The planet." "What part of the planet?" "Yes." Meanwhile, deep inside Control Station 12, a tired Terran systems engineer named Linda Chavez watched energy readings climb across her monitors while warning sirens screamed overhead. An older mechanic leaned over her shoulder and squinted at the numbers. "You think the old grid'll hold together?" Linda snorted softly. "Absolutely not." "Then why are we doing it?" She gave him a flat look. "Because they annoyed us." That seemed to answer the question well enough. The first ancient mass driver fired 30 seconds later. A hidden magnetic rail buried inside one of the orbital rings accelerated a solid sun-steel slug to a speed generally associated with bad ideas and extinction events. The projectile crossed half the battle space and hit a Datari cruiser directly through the bow. For one strange second, the ship remained intact. Then the front half simply disappeared, while the rear half continued drifting forward on momentum and poor decision-making. Another mass driver activated almost immediately afterward. Then another. Gigantic sun steel projectiles started tearing through the Datari fleet hard enough to overload shields through sheer kinetic violence. One carrier lost all power after a slug passed close enough to scramble every major system on board. Another cruiser spun apart after getting clipped through the reactor housing. Burning wreckage scattered across low orbit while the solar lances kept firing through the chaos. Qatar stared at the tactical display in growing disbelief. "This is not a factory," he whispered. One exhausted officer quietly replied, "No, sir." Far below, the Sunforge glowed brighter and brighter against the darkness, while ancient systems continued waking across the planet. Deep underneath the surface, buried beneath miles of machinery and molten metal channels, something enormous began coming online for the first time in thousands of years, and the Terrans were grinning about it. By the middle of the third day, the Datari fleet had stopped operating like an invasion force and started behaving more like survivors trapped inside a natural disaster. Formation discipline collapsed completely. Ships drifted out of position trying to avoid solar lances that could suddenly cut across half the system without warning. Damaged cruisers limped through debris fields while emergency broadcasts filled every open frequency. Everywhere Admiral Qatar looked, something expensive was either on fire, exploding, or about 5 seconds away from becoming both. And somehow the Terrans still looked calm. That part was starting to feel personal. Inside the Dominion Claw, the bridge lights flickered again as another overload rolled through the tactical systems. One exhausted officer looked up from his station. "Sir, we've confirmed additional orbital movement around the fourth planet." Qatar closed his eyes for a second. "Of course we have." "No, sir, I mean significant movement." The tactical display zoomed inward toward the Sunforge. Then everybody on the bridge went silent. The ancient orbital rings surrounding the planet had started separating. Massive sections of the structure slowly rotated apart while hidden internal systems unfolded from inside the ancient framework. Giant magnetic rails extended outward across hundreds of kilometers. Entire clusters of solar mirrors changed alignment simultaneously. Power readings spiked so high several Datari sensors simply shut themselves down rather than continue trying to process the numbers. One officer swallowed nervously. "Sir, I think the factory is reconfiguring." Qatar stared at the screen. "Into what?" Nobody answered, mostly because nobody wanted to say the words out loud. Down on the surface of Quintar, the workers had stopped trying to hide what they were doing. The entire planet had shifted into full wartime production. Massive foundries glowed white-hot through the night, while cargo convoys carried fresh sun steel armor plating directly from smelters to fabrication yards. Automated assembly systems screamed non-stop as new weapons platforms rolled off production lines faster than the Datari could destroy them. Turns out, invading the Federation's primary military foundry during wartime had one unexpected side effect. Production schedules got motivated. Inside one gigantic fabrication chamber, Hank Mercer stood beside a half-finished combat platform while welders showered sparks across the hull plating. Nearby, a group of Quinari civilians watched in stunned silence as workers installed heavy magnetic cannons onto what had very obviously started life as industrial mining equipment. One Quinari finally pointed at the machine. "That is not legal." A welder looked over from behind his visor. "Buddy, legality left this system yesterday." Another worker banged on the side of the machine proudly. "Ain't she purty, though?" The combat platform immediately discharged a test round through 3 walls and part of the ceiling. "Still tuning her," the welder admitted. Up in orbit, things got dramatically worse for the Datari. The separated orbital rings completed their rotation and finally revealed what the Terrans had secretly spent 40 years building inside the ancient framework. The original alien foundry had apparently included some kind of enormous stellar energy distribution network buried throughout the system. The Terrans had turned it into a gun, not a normal gun neither. A civilization-ending kind of gun. Across thousands of kilometers, the solar mirrors aligned simultaneously and focused directly into the center of the expanding ring structure. Energy readings spiked so high, several Datari crews started praying. The very vacuum around the orbital array shimmered from heat distortion, while magnetic fields rolled through nearby debris clouds like invisible storms. One terrified Datari officer whispered, "Sweet mercy." Qatar finally found his voice. "All ships retreat immediately." That order came about 2 days too late. The main stellar lance fired. The beam crossing the battle space looked less like a weapon and more like somebody had ripped open the surface of the sun itself. White gold energy tore through the center of the Datari fleet and erased everything in its path. Not destroyed, erased. 3 cruisers vanished instantly. A carrier group ceased existing halfway through evasive maneuvers. Shields overloaded so violently nearby, ships got hit by expanding plasma shock waves from their own allies detonating. The beam continued straight through the fleet and out into deep space, where it clipped the edge of an asteroid moon and sliced the thing clean apart. For several seconds, nobody aboard the Dominion Claw spoke at all. Then one tactical officer quietly muttered, "They pointed the star at us." And honestly, that was pretty much the whole situation right there. Panic spread through the Datari fleet. Ships broke formation completely now, fleeing in every direction while collision alarms screamed across local space. Some vessels tried blind emergency jumps despite unstable navigation data. Others simply ran. The Sunforge kept firing anyway. Solar lances swept through retreating ships while mass drivers hammered anything slow enough to target. Asteroid tugs joined the pursuit like old ranch dogs chasing thieves off the property. One Datari destroyer managed to escape the main battle, only to get blindsided by what sensors later confirmed was an industrial refinery section traveling at irresponsible speed. Back on the surface, the workers gathered outside the foundries to watch burning debris streak across the night sky. Some folks cheered. Others just looked tired. A few workers immediately started arguing about salvage rights before half the wreckage even finished crashing. Hank Mercer sipped coffee beside the refinery windows while emergency crews moved through the facility behind him. A younger Quinari looked up nervously. "Do you think they'll come back?" Hank watched another burning Datari ship break apart in orbit. "Oh, I doubt it." Then he took another sip and added, "But if they do, we got plenty more ideas." About 6 hours later, the first Terran Federation warships finally arrived from the Vicari front, expecting a desperate rescue operation. Instead, they dropped into a system where the battle was already over. Burning Datari wreckage drifted everywhere. The remaining enemy ships were fleeing toward deep space. And orbiting the 4th planet, the ancient Sunforge continued glowing like an angry artificial sun, while refinery workers calmly resumed industrial operations underneath it. One Federation admiral stared at the tactical feed for a very long moment before asking the only reasonable question left. "What in the hell happened here?" A tired refinery supervisor answered over comms. "Industrial accident." Turns out the Datari Assembly learned something important that week. If humans ever build a factory powered by a star, you probably ought to leave it alone.
That's the story. Now, if you like getting these a little early, memberships are open. Appreciate you either way. If you want more like this, there's more on this channel. And if you feel like sticking around, hit subscribe. My Patreon site is SciFi Signal A J Maraine. Ebooks by A J Maraine are also out there. All right. I'll see you on the next one.